Hi everyone. I'm going to do something rather quickly for you today, I think. It's a landscape view, but I want to concentrate on painting skies. I talk a lot about, generally, I think it's true, at least for me, it's best to play down the area of a sky in a painting of a cityscape or sometimes even a landscape, if it is not the focus of your painting. I think a lot of times we're inspired to make a big deal out of the sky, and if it's the focus of your painting, the star of the show, if you will, that can work. But often what you end up with is a subject or two subjects, the sky and whatever else you're painting. So it's important to get them to play nicely together, to orchestrate them, to design them. But that said, I'm going to do a painting with a subject, a building. Just for the record, where we are here is outside Vicenza, Italy. This is the Villa Rotonda, very famous residence, one of a number of them designed and built by Andrea Palladio around 1570, I believe. So a very influential bit of architecture. The thing about this building, though, is it's, despite its beauty and classical symmetry, it's quite simple. It's literally symmetrical on all four sides. So I'm going to try to treat the landscape elements and the architectural elements in a pared down, simplistic way in order to give the area of sky a little bit more precedent, a little bit more of a front and center. We'll see. Usually I recommend, if you're doing that, to really play down everything in your composition and give a lot more area to the sky. I've sort of split the difference a bit. I have crowded the information down, the visual information down on a vertical format, whereas normally if I were painting this, I'd probably do it in a landscape horizontal format. So I've given more real estate to the area of the sky, and I'm hoping that I can make all the visual elements of the painting play nicely together. Here's a reference photo of the building. So you can see it's quite beautiful, very classical, obviously, but simple. And the only other thing in the painting are the landscape elements, trees in the background, and some lawn and a driveway I've invented for the foreground. It does not look like that. But I wanted it to be there to anchor the painting, but to be a little more simple than it really is. All right. I'm working on a quarter sheet, so it's not a very large painting, 15 by 12 inches. This is Baohong Master Choice watercolor paper, 300 gram rough surface. I love the surface. It may not be the best for what I'm doing, and I say that because it's highly textured, so it can give you a very intentionally grainy final effect, which I love, but I think maybe it's more appropriate for cityscapes and gritty urban views. For pure atmospheric conditions like I want, I think it'll work, but it may not be the best choice. But it's what I used because I just happened to have it handy. So, we'll see. There are no shortage of ways to paint skies. This is one way, a way I like. So what I'm doing with a sort of smallish, mid-sized mop brush is just painting in with clear water, so no color at all. Very, very intuitive, scratchy. Some areas of wet on the dry paper. I'm going to flip this upside down now. size of my stretcher board might be a problem. I don't want it to fall off camera, but hopefully you can see what I'm doing. I'm just going in with clear blue. This is a manganese and a bit of cobalt mixed in. And I'm painting it on dry paper. I'm going to try to nail the color and value in one go because it will be hard to go back and revisit this. So what I'm doing is painting on dry paper, but I'm bumping this blue wash into the wet water wash that I just did so that I get a nice variety of edges. You know, which isn't always what a sky looks like, but I think if you want a sky with activity and character to it, this is one way to go about it. It's a pretty easy way to paint cloud shapes. So you're really using the negative unpainted bits of the paper underneath. And always in watercolor, don't forget your friend gravity. You can allow gravity to pull your paint around in the directions you want it to run. I'm pretty happy with these shapes. I'm relatively happy with these shapes, but while this is wet, you have some opportunity to massage, manipulate some of these shapes if you want to. Generally, good advice to do less. So now what I want to try to do is just, my sky design idea is this band of very large cumulus clouds, white-ish, white and gray, diagonally cutting across a very blue sky, and then darker clouds under with a bit of light in the yellow family along the horizon. Don't have a sketch, it's just all in my mind, hoping I can make this work. So for the darker bits of the clouds, I'm going to do this before it dries. If it starts to look like it's drying, you can reintroduce some water with a mist bottle. What I've got here is a bit of violet into which I dropped some raw umber. I think even in a very, very blue sky day, if you can modify your clouds with a little bit of warm, ochres or pale red sometimes, it just gives them much more life. You get this nice, warm, cool vibration. So as these clouds go down, I'm using some of the blue I already used, mixing it on the palette with a little bit of that warm violet gray that I had. The thinking here is if you can get clouds to look like they have some curvature, some dimension, it's generally always a good idea so that they don't look too, they don't look like a flat decorated surface, but they look like there's a bit of sky dome with the sky curving around. This is just pure violet, diluted with water, but not mixed with any other color. This is a mineral violet by Holbein. And I am cutting around the house because I know that some bits of this architecture are going to want to remain pretty light. I'm tilting the board up and down, a little bit sideways here and there to try to get these intentional blossoms I'm making to run in interesting or satisfying ways. As I creep down nearer the horizon, I'm starting to flatten out the sky shapes, the cloud shapes, so that they become more stratus. A little bit of dry brush, which I may or may not save. We'll see. I want to work quickly if I can. There's these statues on the roof I want to save out as white, so if I were smart, I would have masked them out, but I hate masking, so I didn't. It's not too hard to cut around them. These brushes are quite handy for that. They make very nice points. At this point, we're down into the line of trees, so I don't need to worry too much, but I want a nice clean line around the top, the profile of the building. It's still pretty wet, so it's a good time to assess how it looks and manipulate it in any way I want. So I'm dropping a little bit more blue here and there. This part is starting to set, so it's not going to be easy to manipulate anything from about this point up. I don't really like those dry brush marks too much. A few, I guess, are okay. I was intending to put a band of ochre along the horizon, but I think much of it's going to be covered by trees, so I might do it anyway, but I don't think we're going to see too much of it. Something splattered up in my important to keep going, but I'm just assessing how I'm doing, because while it's still wet, it's still alive. So once it starts to dry, I won't be able to change much of anything. Yeah, but generally I'm happy. I think it could use a little bit more character up here. So hopefully that's not too dry. It's just some of this blue-gray. I'll add a few more cloud shadows. Right, okay, right at the horizon. This is some Daniel Smith permanent orange. Again, much of this I think is going to be covered with trees, but maybe not all of it. So I just wanted this really nice warm glow along the horizon. You may have figured I haven't planned this painting out as completely as I often do. I've just sort of designed it in my head. Partially that's because clouds, it's okay to have an idea, like a basic idea of cloud shapes, but you can't plan them too much, and you definitely can't draw them on the paper too effectively. At least I can't. They end up looking very tight and rigid if you paint them to lines that you've already drawn. I do like the way that violet gray resolves into the ochre orange tones. So I hope I'll be able to manipulate some of the tree shapes to just get a little glimmer of some of that amber glow. It's very wet. I think I can begin the trees soon because I don't need them to have terribly hard edges against the sky. Not all of them anyway. But it's a little too wet yet, so I won't. But I think what I'll do is sort of a base wash on the foreground. That'll give this a moment or two to dry up, and I can tie it into the background here and there if I wish. I do wish I'd planned out this the design here a little bit better. The shapes I like, but the house is going to remain largely light except for the shade and shadows, and I wanted this hint of the pathway going up to the house to remain light as well. So I guess I have a plan. Simplicity is the name of the game for the foreground. So this is it's fairly diluted. It's a little bit of jadeite, but I think I'm going to use a fresher sap green and a bit of serpentine green. Yes. I like the color green quite a lot, but green pigment I find frustrating to paint. I don't know that I'm an expert in it, but I have found a few tips. Variety in your greens helps, modifying them with some reds, some browns, some blues if you want them to be quieter, fresher greens, darker greens. I mean, you can't go too crazy, but variety in your green shapes will really help keep them looking lively. I've found most green pigments tend to dry fairly gray and flat looking, and they're not appealing for the most part. The way I've managed to salvage some of mine is variety. Yes, some yellower greens, so a little hotter. And then that resolves into some red greens and some bluish tones over here. Again, I want to keep this very simple, but I want it to look good. Here, as it gets away from the center, I don't mind that it creeps up and joins, connects up with the background. I like that quite a lot. That was my hope. Gonna try to do the same back here, but with just cerulean, just pure yellow. Doesn't much matter, you're not gonna see much of that. Now I've designed into my fake landscape kind of a little rise and fall of the landscape. Don't know if, well, I do know that that's not at all what it looks like, but that's okay. So all my stressing out down here, hopefully it'll work out. One advantage it's giving me is allowing this area to dry up a bit, so I'll be ready to go back in there and revisit it soon. I'm using the mist bottle here to make the foreground much more gestural and impressionistic, sort of knock back any hard lines and neutralize sort of the foreground altogether. Hopefully what this approach does, I use this technique a lot, it keeps the viewer's eye from focusing too much on the foreground, makes it more neutral, and the viewer just jumps over it to the center of interest, which in this design is going to be in the distant midground. Some bit of raw umber and a little bit of cobalt blue on the roadway. Some burnt sienna. Just a nice, neutral, warm tone. So I don't think I am finished with this landscaping area, but all I did here was just to try to establish basic shapes and values, which I think I did. Pretty happy with that. It can be tricky, but it doesn't need to be. But it's one of these things that watercolor does so beautifully, where it can transition very quickly from clarity and hard edges to really impressionistic expressions. Obviously, other painting mediums can do that as well, but I don't think any do it with the beauty that watercolor manages. That ability for one thing to just become another thing. It's just so gorgeous in watercolor. Right. The background trees, I could do them later. I could work on the building or do the trees behind. Don't think it matters too much. I want the pretty dark to pop out this. As far as a value design, I talk a lot about that in my classes. What I'm doing here is sort of pushing all of my values into the distant midground, and then I'm going to have a pattern of the dominant darks and lights reading through here, rather than placing them spatially in the foreground or the background. I'm going to have them reading all straight through here in the midground. So dark, light, dark, essentially, with this being the lightest and these the darkest. Obviously there are supplemental lights in the sky, of course, and in the roadway, but you'll get this nice pattern, I hope, of lights reading through the painting this way, as well as a nice pattern along the x-axis of darks and lights that way. I think I'd be better off to try to establish the darks. Usually they're the last things to go in, but I think I'm going to establish a lot of them now because I think it'll make it easier for me to then decide how dark the shades and shadows on the house itself have to be. I have a pretty good idea, but I think this will just make my job easier. This is a liner brush, a Davinci Casenio, with the long quills sticking out, the big fat barrel. I use this often for landscaping. It's especially useful on textured paper. You just sort of lay it on its side and scrape it around without too much water. And you can get these relatively convincing tree shapes happening. It's fine, but really need to be much darker. Not all of it, but a lot of it. Especially right up next to the house. So I'm dropping in some Van Dyke brown, very deep, warm tone. And even some deeper violets here and there. These areas will be, for the most part, the darkest value. One of the best ways to get a deep green is to mix a deep red, like an alizarin perhaps. So here's some alizarin mixed with a jadeite green, Daniel Smith dark green. It gets pretty close to black without being blacks and maintaining its transparency. So I don't need a lot, but yes, I need that really rich, deep value just there. Some of these very characteristic cypress trees that you often see in Umbria, Tuscany. Fun trees to paint, relatively easy if you don't overthink it and do too much. Doesn't really need much more. I think this area could be a little bit fleshed out. But again, I'm trying to save some of that warm glow along the horizon. Although it's dried out. More neutral than I had hoped, but it's okay. All right, here it's slightly more foreground part of the midground along this little rise in the driveway. I'm going to drop in some little group of landscape elements, much darker, but it's a little too wet to do that yet. Just a moment, I'll do those. Some cobalt teal, just to freshen up some of those greens that are starting to get that gray cast that green pigment can so often get. Yeah, this is cobalt teal blue. Yeah, this paper isn't as dry under as I thought it was. It's not all bad, but some of these little edges aren't as crisp as I might have hoped, but I'm not gonna complain. It's okay. Here and there, I'm using a small flat brush just to join up shapes and get some of those nice textural dry brush marks that are very handy. Makes it look as if you painted detail that you really haven't painted. More of the teal, a little bit more opaque. Just to give more variety to those greens. This is neutral tint. It's sort of a deep violet gray, neutral, very transparent though. So it isn't real gray or black. It looks pretty dark, but it'll still stay transparent. Okay, yeah. I'm thinking I probably want a little too much variety in some of these greens, so dropping in a little alizarin just to gray out some of the fresher bits, add a little bit more value just up against the house. And I think that's pretty good. I did like the way this landscape resolved up into that corner of the painting. It's not a big deal, but I did like it. So I think I'm going to try to recreate it while it's still wet-ish. Just to add a little ambiguity, a few more sense of connection over there. Yes, nice. All right. Now I can begin thinking about the house. I'm glad in this case, like I said earlier, I almost always do my darkest darks last. But this time, I put them in before the end because it will help me assess how much value I want to use on the actual tonalities of the house itself. I want very much to keep it simple, which sounds good, but begs the question, okay, how do you do that? So I want to keep the colors minimal, which they really are in real life, so that helps a bit. I want to keep the textures minimal. I want to keep the pigments I use minimal. It has, in reality, a red tile roof. Of course, as an artiste, you should feel free to change up anything you don't like or would prefer to see differently. I think the warm of the red, though, will sing off nicely all the cools on the sky and in the landscape, so I'll be true to Mr. Palladio. I'm using a Escoda Perla series flat. I have a number of these. They're synthetic, very nice for holding edges and for dry brush work, but somehow handy for this kind of almost detail work. There's a bit of violet I'm going to use here, let it run into the red of the roof to imply the curvature of the actual rotunda on the top. On the very dark side, a little bit of Van Dyke brown. Again, I'm just trying to allow those tonalities to run together if they feel like it. The round roof way up top is copper, which again, I can change it if I want, but I'm just going to use a very simple swipe of cobalt teal up there to imply that patinaed metal roof. I think it's copper. Not altogether sure. I'm sure it's been changed over the centuries or updated. All right, I'm trying to thread the needle of making this not overly architectural, even though by definition it is. But I'm trying to beat back my tendency to over detail it and just use this small flat brush and just dry brush in some indicators of the shades, the shadows, and details, and not become too obsessive about making it absolutely accurate or precise. The drawing I did is pretty precise, and the simplicity of the design itself should help the viewer to just understand what's happening. So it's, over the years, a good lesson for me to realize you do not have to show. I think this is especially true when you're painting architecture. You do not have to show the viewer everything. You can just show them a little bit, a few little hints of details perhaps. The viewer's eye can fill in the rest. And in a house this symmetrical, it will be even easier for the viewer to understand what's happening. So here there's a deep set colonnade, and I don't feel any need to be overly descriptive about it. I'm just going to imply the deep shadow on the portico, and that should be just about enough to get the story across. For the deeper areas, I'm using a little bit of gold tone, which is some of that orange tone that I used before on the landscape. It's key here for me to keep simplicity front and center. Otherwise, I really don't want to take away from that sky, which came out pretty well. And I want it to be a little, at least as focal as the house. I have this idea in mind that they work together, almost like co-stars, but I don't want one to shout too much louder than the other one. So far I'm doing okay, but it's always my tendency to use these warm tones and shadows, especially in warmer climates like Italy, because they pick up a lot of bounced and reflected light. And that's fine, but I don't think I want to go too wild with it for that reason, that I don't want it to dominate. So I started that shadow shade washout with a little bit of yellow ochre, and then I'm dropping in mineral violet at the base of it. It's one of my go-to color combos. This is such a remarkable building. I visited it a few times. All around that Veneto area, Palladio has a number of these private residences, very experimental designs at the time, and they really hold up. They look surprisingly current, even though they're centuries old. So yes, the maniacal architect within me wants to go further, but I think I'm leaving it. I want to quit while I'm ahead. Use the same sort of recipe over here. This is a yellow ochre with a little bit of that orange mixed in the palette. And then I'll toggle into the mineral violet. Hopefully I can get these two to join up. And what I'm trying to do is just keep these shapes of shade and shadow very blocky, very simple and expressive, but not overly detailed. I have the option here, because these areas of trees are still wet, to bounce this wash over into the trees and let them connect a little. Not sure it's the thing to do, but I'm going to do it anyway. The bottom of that shadow, as it intersects the landscape, while it's still wet, I'm going to use just a little bit of French ultramarine to darken it slightly, increase subtly the contrast there. And yeah, that's good. For the most part, that's all I want to do for the architecture. I can see myself coming back and detailing it after, but I hope I don't do much, if anything. Just don't think it needs it. And now I think as a painting overall, there's a really nice orchestration between the natural world, the man-made world, landscaping, atmosphere, architecture. They're all sort of playing together nicely. To finish up the painting doesn't need too much. A little bit here, as I said earlier. And I'm sure I'm going to want to think about if I want to add anything to this. I know that I will, but I hope I don't do too much. I just think whatever I put from here down will naturally compete with this, so I have to make sure it's needed and not something I can just edit away, because if I can edit away and it won't bring anything to the composition, then that's what I should do. Here, this isn't really the foreground, but it's the nearer midground. There are some elements of landscaping I wanted to include. Not to be pictorial, but I thought they would help better balance and anchor the overall composition. But again, I don't want to do anything here that's going to detract from this. I think so far it's not. I think I'm okay. And it also helps subtly establish a little bit more of a sense of foreground, midground, background in a narrower range. But yeah, so I think it's okay. A little bit more French ultramarine. Modify these darker landscape bits with cools, blues, rather than warms, for variety. I don't like the way this and this are too similar. I this hill is cresting, that would probably pick up a little more sun as it is. So I think this area of landscaping behind wants to be a little darker, not up against the house necessarily, but as it turns down into the landscape. It's not such a big deal, but it's a deal. It's a big enough deal that it bothers me. So with a flat 1/2 inch, just adding some water for now. Bit more sap green, obviously much fresher green. And I'll resolve that into a deeper green. This is the jadeite. Yeah, I mean already you can tell it's a much more believable rise and fall in the landscape. It also helps squeeze all the contrast and into the center of focus and less here in the foreground. Here, I'm not sure I should do this. I think I should, so I'm going to do it. But just a simple line to subtly indicate the demarcation of this driveway. Just a dry brush mark, but I want to fade out naturally. Yeah, that's all right. And possibly another here, but in the landscape. So anyway, that's pretty much it. Again, I'm notorious for being unable to leave my paintings alone, as you can see, and I don't recommend it. I always counsel everybody to stop right before you think you're done, because you're probably anything you're going to do is going to make it worse, not better. But I don't often take my own advice. In this case, I hope I do. It's a fairly fresh painting and simple, which is what I wanted. I wanted the center of interest here in the distant, the near background or the distant midground, where the dark, light, dark pattern read through on the x-axis, but you got the secondary y-axis in the vertical of this curvilinear patterning of lights. Light, 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 reading up through here. So it's a very nice intersection. Secondarily, as I talked a lot about, I wanted this nice orchestration between the natural world, both landscaping and atmosphere, and the built environment. And I think that works pretty well. This, had it been more detailed, would have been made a more architectural type of drawing, which isn't a bad thing to do, but not quite what I wanted here. I wanted this real dialogue between the man-made world and the natural world, which I think makes any architecture more interesting. The context of architecture is in a way everything. Otherwise, they're just objects sitting in space. But when they play off or are in dialogue with their with their context, then you can get some real stories and some poetry if you're lucky. Lastly, I wanted to just talk about ways of painting skies. There are loads of ways. This is one way I often use, sort of a wet on dry and then wet and wet approach, sort of a combination. That, yeah, if you're lucky, can work pretty well. And I think in this case, it did what I wanted. It made an animated sky that isn't overly dominant, but it's lively and has this energetic diagonal patterning to it that I think works quite well with all the rectilinear aspects of the built environment. Anyway, thank you for watching, and I'm sure I will see you again soon. Happy painting, everybody.